So it's now my pleasure to turn the podium over to Dale Mitchell, the Executive Director of Ethos, a very well-known and respected elder services organization in the Boston area. Yeah.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Kevin. And I just want to say, for many years, my path has been occasionally crossed with Kevin, and it's been a great pleasure to work with him more closely and more formally on the LGBT Aging Commission. I think state government is very lucky to have someone as knowledgeable and dedicated as Kevin. For those of you who are not familiar, perhaps, with Ethos, just bear with me. I will give you a little bit the elevator speech about what Ethos is. We are one of 26 state designated by the Executive Office of Elder Affairs as an aging services access point. And in that capacity, we coordinate the provision of all publicly funded long-term support services for elders, people age 60 and older, in our respective area. And the respective area that Ethos has been designated as an ASAP, Aging Services Access Point, is Southwest Boston, and we have been in existence since 1973. So we have over 40 years of experience of doing this, a lot of knowledge about the needs of elderly and increasingly disabled people. Next slide, please. So I am chair of the Long-Term Support Services LTSS work group, and I will be reporting to you on the context for the recommendations and the recommendations themselves. Dr. Cahill will be going through in greater depth demographic information about the cohort, but there are some particular demographic characteristics for older LGBTs, lesbian, gays, bisexual, and transgender that are particularly relevant to the question of long-term support services, and in particular, keeping them at home and in the community for as long as possible, which is the mission of my organization and all other 25 aging service access points in the Commonwealth. So there are a number of very relevant characteristics for older LGBTs that make them stand out in relationship to their heterosexual peers. One is that they are more likely to be disabled than straight people. And they are, and that's relevant because data indicates that for anyone who lives past the age of 65, for all of them, 2/3 of them will need help with what we call activities of daily living for some considerable period of time before they die. So that indicator means that more than 2/3 of LGBT older adults will need help with those activities of daily living. What is the source of support for those people? Most of those people, the strongest source of ongoing support is the existence of what we call informal caregivers, family and friends. That creates, however, a burden, so to speak, for older LGBTs because they are less likely to be partnered and married than their heterosexual peers. They are more likely to be childless, and the main source of caregiving support in the United States is either spouses or children, and they are more likely to be estranged from their biological family, the other pillar of caregiving, informal caregiving support. Particularly for the older cohort that we are dealing with now, which came of age before the Stonewall Rebellion, which is the demarcating point in the civil rights movement for LGBTs. They have a long history of generally very negative experiences with the helping professions. Before 1972, homosexuality was deemed a mental illness. There were typical cures that were bandied about: castration, lobotomies, electroshock treatment. Religion declared homosexuality to be a sin. It was a very pervasively repressive environment which had major impact on the LGBT community in its relationship with a broadly defined helping profession, which would include elder services agencies, psychologists, psychiatrists, even medical practitioners. And as a result of that history, there's a lot of evidence that indicates that they are less likely and much more reluctant to seek help from mainstream service providers. Next slide, please. So that leads to a conclusion which is really central to the LTSS recommendations in the LGBT Aging Commission report, that LGBT older adults are at greater risk of nursing home admission than straights. That has consequences for the Commonwealth. Nursing home care is more expensive than home care, so therefore it has an implication for taxpayers. It has nursing home admissions mean a lower quality of life and a shorter life expectancy than elders who are in the community. The average life expectancy for residents of nursing homes is around 6 months. The average length of time for involvement with the home care system is over 3 years. And it also leads to some rather unsettling conclusions about disparities in care. If, in fact, the Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court ruled in the Olmstead decision that it is a violation of a disabled person's constitutional right to unnecessarily segregate them in an institutional setting outside of the community. And so these factors raise, I think, some very troubling concerns around disparate treatment between LGBT older adults and straight older adults in terms of their ability to reside within the community. Next slide, please. I feel like I'm on some TV game show. Next slide, please. So there are some policy deficiencies that we have identified as part of the LTSS recommendations for the Commission report. Kevin has already mentioned a number of these, so I won't go into great detail. Provider training. There is no mandated provider training for any sector within state government for LGBT cultural competency. There is language in the state budget that allows for the Executive Office of Elder Affairs to fund that, but it is not mandatory. And we're talking about a system that spends probably $5 to $6 billion. That might be off a little bit in terms of state taxpayer dollars. So it's a very significant sector of state government. In terms of care planning, there is, with one exception, and we'll get into this, I will get into this in a little bit later in my presentation, almost a universal silence in terms of personal needs assessments for any program of state government in terms of assessing an applicant or an enrollee's sexual orientation or gender identity. And you can imagine the importance of that information in terms of the provision of personal care, let's say, just as an example, for a transgender person. That presents some challenges that really requires a very trained and competent and compassionate workforce. And then in terms of access back to the deep-seated feelings of wariness on the part of the LGBT older population. There has been a history of insufficient outreach, affirmative action, if you will, in terms of mitigating that deep mistrust amongst LGBT older adults. And then also the vulnerability to bullying from non-LGBT consumers toward LGBT consumers in a variety of settings. And I think this is a much underexplored area of need, hearing increasingly reports of bullying and harassment in senior housing and in nursing homes and assisted living. Next slide, please. Foundational recommendations, what we call foundation. We didn't want to get into the question of prioritizing, but we did recognize that there are some foundational recommendations without which none of the other recommendations can really fall into place. And these are two. One is provider training for the networks for the three priority agencies of state government. From our point of view, the Executive Office of Health and Services, the Executive Office of Elder Affairs, and the Department of Housing and Community Development. There is currently, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later, only the Executive Office of Elder Affairs has addressed that. And that is really through the advocacy efforts of the LGBT community in terms of getting that language inserted in their own state budget. And then the other foundational recommendation is to provide opportunities for applicants, consumers, enrollees to be able to self-identify as LGBT in terms of their own sexual orientation or in terms of their own gender identity or expression in terms of program needs assessments. And we will talk a little bit about some of the progress that's happened there in a minute, but that is also foundational. It's our opinion that care planning, either on a regional, a geographic basis or on an individual or a family basis, is inadequate if it ignores very important information about sexual orientation and gender identity. Next slide, please. So here we have some of the highlights for the recommendations for the LTSS section, and this is some, not all. I refer you to the full report for more in-depth analysis. Non-discrimination clauses in all state provider contracts. I do not believe that currently exists. I could be wrong on that point, but if I didn't want to exclude that just out of fear that I might be wrong, because it is important if we are correct. An LGBT ombudsperson within the Executive Office of Health and Human Services that would deal with complaints and issues and concerns from LGBT citizens in terms of the provision of human and housing services, state-funded human and housing services. Inclusion of LGBT resources in all state-funded information and referral systems. I don't know to what extent that is a meaningful term outside of aging services, but aging services really starts with a very robust provision of free and comprehensive information and referral services to the general public, and it's only in very limited instances where that information also includes information for LGBT-friendly services. LGBT-friendly registries for attendance for the personal care attendant program, the PCA program, and for adult foster care. I think the issues there should be obvious. Your PCA is there to help you on a daily basis with all kinds of needs. If you are LGBT, you might want to have an LGBT-friendly PCA. If you are going in as a guest, as a resident in an adult foster care setting, you might want, as an LGBT, to know whether or not your host is either LGBT or LGBT friendly. And then finally, gay straight alliances, for lack of a better term. They're in high schools, public schools, private schools all across the Commonwealth. We are proposing a replication of those under whatever name in senior housing and assisted living, I think for obvious reasons. Next slide, please. Then another bucket in which we put other recommendations, and Kevin has already talked about this. Sean will talk about it some more. I've already mentioned the importance of opportunities for self-identification for sexual orientation and gender identity. Without that, there is no way to collect data on an aggregate basis. So it is both a foundation for developing appropriate care plans for individuals, but it's also a sine qua non for data collection across the system. To what extent are LGBT older adults participating in the state home care program? We don't know. To what extent is there a disparity there? We don't know. And then also there has been a lot of early studies done that indicates that LGBT older adults are not doing well financially. It's a common stereotype that gay men in particular tend to be better off, or white gay men in particular tend to be better off than others. The data is showing something very different, including for white gay men and particularly for older lesbians who generally did not marry or did not marry men and had to work for their whole lives, and they worked for their whole lives in situations where women were discriminated against. So we're asking the state to look into this question a little bit better, and there are mechanisms through planning processes required by the federal government for receipt of Older American Act funding to do this. Next slide, please. And then the third bucket for recommendations is around service delivery. For those of you who are not keyed into aging services, there are entities called area agencies on aging. There's 26 of them around the Commonwealth. Generally, they are the same as state-designated aging service access points, ASAPs, but not always. I won't go into all of that. But we want to make sure that there is at least one LGBT-friendly, that's a term of art that we will be using a lot, LGBT-friendly service in each of those 26 areas. An example of that would be what we call a community cafe or an elder congregate meal site, of which my agency, I'm very proud to say, operates 5.
Can you just ask you to stay close to the microphone?
I'm sure.
I want to make sure the webinar folks can hear you as well as we can.
Well, I don't want to know what you didn't hear. Okay, so then also allow spouses to be personal care attendants, PCAs for the personal care attendant program. We know of one example because that's a no-no. Specific to Massachusetts, we know of one instance where a couple got divorced in order for the partner to remain as a paid PCA under the personal care attendant program. Also because nursing homes are, I can't even describe for you the fear and loathing that older LGBTs have about the prospect of going into nursing homes, which in and of itself is not unusual. I think everyone has that panic and has that fear, but for LGBTs it means going back into the closet. We consider nursing homes to be institutional closets. And so we're very much into developing alternatives for nursing homes for people who would otherwise need those settings and are really not appropriate, who don't have the resources, personal or financial, to stay at home. And so we are recommending the development of small LGBT-friendly group homes. to develop virtual senior style programming on a regional basis for LGBT elders. LGBT elders are also very reluctant to go to senior centers for the reasons that they're reluctant to go into nursing homes or they're reluctant to go into senior housing. Make people with HIV who are under the age of 60, which is the qualifying age for state home care services, eligible for state home care services. There is a precedent for this. Younger people who have early onset of Alzheimer's are also recognized as and deemed eligible for the state home care program. We're recommending this because there is also evidence of a phenomenon called accelerated aging for long-term survivors with HIV and AIDS, and they need the help with daily activities of daily living. 5 minutes. And I'm almost finished. Develop an HIV prevention program for older adults. There currently is none. Next slide, please. Older adults are sexually active. Okay, accomplishments. Here we are, and I just want to give a shout-out. I've been working on this for a long time. I want to give a shout-out to the Secretary of the Executive Office of Elder Affairs, Alice Bonner, who is the first one in state government to have actually taken up the call to give us an opportunity to identify in these program applications, in these personal needs assessments, which she has now done for the state home care program. So we hope that is the beginning of a more comprehensive approach to this question, but I'm very, very pleased and proud of Secretary Bonner for her leadership in this area. And also Elder Affairs, and I'm sure Anna will talk more about this, has proposed regulations. They haven't been implemented yet. They haven't been approved, I think, by the 11th floor to expand the definition of caregivers to recognize the existence of chosen families, that a caregiver is no longer defined as your spouse or your blood relative. And for those of us who don't have or have bad relationships with our blood relatives that have really good, strong chosen families, that's what we call them, that's really important, really important. Next slide, please. And that's, again, Secretary Bonner. Thank you. So we have short-term priorities. Again, we're working with self-identification. We want to go from home care to the Senior Care Options Program, the One Care program, the PCA program, all the other long-term support service programs that people can turn to get help. And we want SOGI to be a part of assessments that are done for nursing facility and rest home admissions, obviously. I mean, duh. Okay, next slide. Access, we want to look more into the status of people with HIV. We want, again, non-discrimination clauses in provider contracts. Again, we want LGBT-friendly resources for information and referral services. We want protective services, again, because people are weird. An elder LGBT who's having a problem with a relative or a spouse is not going to want to come to an agency like mine for help with dealing with that abuse. And so the community needs to be assured that those services are LGBT friendly. And then more outreach to LGBT veterans. Next slide. Service delivery. We've already talked about expanding state home care eligibility to younger people with HIV, and already mentioned HIV prevention for older adults. I think this is my last slide. Next slide, please.